Welcome, my name is Peter Stordy and I teach in the Information School, University of Sheffield. Today's lecture is on globalisation, internationalisation and localisation. Cheap flights, internationalisation of higher education, mobile phone technologies, television and of course the World Wide Web mean our world is more connected than ever. Businesses have to look beyond their own country. Environmental issues cannot be tackled in isolation. Terrorism is an international issue. Countries have to collaborate to seek solutions. Today's lecture is about three related terms: globalisation, internationalisation and localisation. Let's try and distinguish between these three terms. Globalisation, sometimes abbreviated to G11N, the 11 standing for 11 characters between the G and the N in globalisation, is the bigger concept. According to Juncker, it's the equivalent of internationalisation, localisation and a bit of management. It's the process by which businesses or other organisations develop international influence or start operating on an international scale, according to the BBC. Internationalisation, I18N for short, is a process of building or rebuilding a site, a website typically, so that it can be easily localised. Juncker's definition. And Juncker also says that localisation, L10N, is the process of modifying a product for a specific locale. I used to work for Granada Learning in Manchester, and we had to create educational software for various countries. Rather than creating the software for one country and then rewriting it again for another country and rewriting it again for another country, instead we decided to create an internationalised version of the program. That is, the program, but not specific to any particular country, locale, language. And then it was a relatively easy step to localise it for a particular language or country. It was just a case of employing a talented translator. So from a web perspective, why is globalisation, internationalisation and localisation such a big issue? All you need to do is have different versions of the website in different languages or for different countries. Well, as I've just said, it's a time saving, it's a way of making your production more efficient. It may take a little bit longer in the first place to create an internationalised version of your website, but you only need to create 2 or more localised versions for there to be a time saving. I suppose if you were only ever going to have one version of your website for one country and one language, then probably it's not worth internationalising your website. But who knows what the future might hold. As I implied, website developers need to consider not only the user's country, but also their language. Language and country is sometimes called locale. So French is spoken in France, but also in Canada. So we have France French and we have Canadian French. We have UK English, we have American English, we have other countries English, and so on. So a country can have many languages, and a language can be spoken in many countries. So as a relationship, it's a many-to-many relationship. The W3C has standardised all the language codes and all the country codes, and these links here are to the standardised lists. Interestingly, GB is United Kingdom, not UK. Within the HTML, you identify the web page locale within the HTML tag using the language, the lang attribute. Here are 5 examples. A Chinese website, it's for China, a Chinese website for Hong Kong, a Chinese website for Taiwan. Each would be different. For example, Hong Kong and Taiwan use Chinese traditional characters, whereas mainland China typically uses the simplified version. And we have English United States as well as English United Kingdom. There'll be subtle differences between the two, sometimes not so subtle. So why set a HTML lang attribute? Well, I can think of 4 reasons. First of all, screen readers, which are aimed at those who are partially sighted and hear a web page as opposed to see a web page. Well, the browser needs to be able to know what language the web page is written in. So there's a good use of the lang attribute. It makes the localization of pages that have already been localized much easier to identify. Indeed, there's sometimes a requirement to change the layout or the format of a web page based on this particular lang attribute. So typically a more Arabic web page, the text will be aligned to the right, whereas in a more Western web page, the text is aligned to the left. The lang attribute could be used by the browser to determine whether to align text to the left or the right, or indeed choose the most appropriate font. If you were internationalizing Amazon, you might start off with a template, an outline like this. It identifies the main section of the web page and will be common to all localized versions of the website. Indeed, if you look at the Amazon website, no matter what country you view, it has a similar layout because it was based on the same template, the same outline like this. Indeed, the internationalized version of the web page would not only have a common layout, it might have a common web page structure, a common information design, a common navigation design, and the whole site would have a common website architecture. Here are 3 Amazon web pages from different locales, in this case different countries. You can see straight away that there's a common layout, a common look and feel, a common navigation, but there are clearly major differences too because each has been localized for the particular country. Now, localizing a website to a particular language, country, or indeed locale can be quite problematic. Here are some examples, slightly amusing, but examples nonetheless. The clothes company Gap decided to open up a new store in Shanghai, China in 2010. It chose the logo 1969, but unfortunately this is a very sorry year at the very heart of a Chinese decade-long tragedy, the Cultural Revolution. Gap chose it because it just so happened it was the signature brand for when they were founded in 1969. An unfortunate coincidence. The store was forced to remove all the labelling and probably apologise too. These 2 translation blunders do not need explaining. American Airlines introduced its new leather first-class seats in Mexico with a literal translation of their tagline, "Fly in leather," which in Spanish unfortunately meant fly light or indeed fly naked. KFC as a brand decided to enter the Chinese market by translating their famous slogan, "Finger licking good," into Chinese, but unfortunately it came out, "Eat your fingers off." Pepsi is known for its catchphrase, "Come alive with the Pepsi generation." Unfortunately, when they introduced Pepsi to Taiwan and did the translation, it came out as "Pepsi will bring your ancestors back from the dead." You have to be careful with images too. Do not use these symbols in Brazil or Iran, otherwise you could be thrown in jail. Do you accumulate your shopping in a cart or a basket or whatever that says in Chinese? Interestingly, if you look at the .co.uk version of Amazon, it says basket there, but the icon is not of a basket, it's of a trolley. I'm confused, are you? So, things to consider when localizing. Let's consider language. Locale. Managing different languages in the same country is challenging for any organisation. Key is finding a good translator. Ideally a translator who was born in the country. There can be many subtleties that a non-native speaker might miss. Character sets. Some languages can be written in more than one character set. For example, Chinese, there's traditional and there's simplified. Encoding. Each character needs eventually to be converted into binary, ones and zeros, to be stored on the computer or on the web. Now this can be done in different ways. There are different encoding standards, but the standard which you choose has an impact upon how much file space is taken. So if you encode in Unicode UTF-8 or UTF-16, that requires considerably more file space than if you encode in ASCII ISO 8859, which is by default what most browsers encode their characters at. So you might say, well, why not use this ISO standard instead if it takes up less room? Well, yes, it does, but if you're encoding Chinese characters, for example, or Arabic characters, they cannot be encoded in using the ISO standard. So you need to use a Unicode standard to encode it, and therefore it will take up more space. These things need to be considered. Localization difficulties? Well, you try finding an Arabic translator, a good Arabic translator. It is quite challenging. And once you've got a website, how do you enable users to choose the particular locale relevant to them? Do you have a drop-down menu, a splash screen, a country language list? Do you use national flags? There are many issues with all these options. There is no right solution. At this point I thought I would show the HTML from Amazon for Amazon.cn. Notice here that all the HTML stuff and the attribute values included is all in typical ASCII Western characters, English, whereas the actual text that's displayed on the web page is in the local language, in this case Chinese. Or to be stricter, Chinese China. So here's our HTML5 template that we've used in the implementation strand. You can see in red where the locale is specified, and you can see in blue where the encoding is specified. So Amazon.cn uses UTF-8, whereas Amazon.co.uk uses this ISO standard for encoding. Nivea is often cited as having a well-organized, a well-internationalized website. Here is the landing page. Notice no flags. That's generally considered not a good way of directing users to their particular locale. Here is the same web page but two ways of selecting the language. Which do you think is better? The first has a drop down menu, the second one's menu is always displayed. The first is economical in terms of space, but how do you tell users that they've got to click that button in order to view the drop down menu? Very challenging. Issues to consider that are string related. A string, by the way, is one or more characters. If you're creating your international version of the website, you need to think about how much space the language takes up. Going back to my Granada learning experience, we were aware that we were going to localize the program for Wales, and anyone who knows the Welsh language will know that some of the words are quite lengthy, so we had to allow extra space for when it was localized for Wales Welsh. German words are typically longer than Chinese characters. Text direction. Arabic is read from right to left. Sorting rules. How do you sort Chinese characters? Special characters. How are you going to deal with the copyright symbol? Are you going to embed that on the page? It will work well with UTF-8, but if it was being displayed in ISO, it might not display, and you need to use the character entity, ampersand copy semicolon, or indeed include a small image of the copyright symbol. And as we said before, embedding words, strings within images is a convenient way of displaying difficult characters. However, it makes changing the words within the image more difficult. Issues to consider: data formatting. Date formats. In the US, it's month, date, year, whereas in the UK, it's typically date, month, year. Currencies will change between different locales, pound sign, dollar sign, yen sign, and so on. Even the way you display numbers changes. In some countries, you group them in threes and separate the groups of threes with a comma. In other countries, you leave a space. There can be many different telephone formats. There can be many different address formats. Indeed, there's about 100 types of postcode. Issues to consider: user interface. Well, there are serious religious issues. In some countries, some images might be considered blasphemous and you might end up in jail. Colours can have different meanings in different countries or different locales. Black signifies death in the West, but in Asia, white signifies death. Be careful about foreign is good. If you were developing a web page which was predominantly going to be viewed by people in, let's say, China, do you include photographs with predominantly people who look like they might come from China, or do you include photographs of people who look from other parts of the world? You need to think about the users. What do they want to see? Cultural issues, well, we've already mentioned hand gestures, but festivals are not common throughout the world, and we've also mentioned the shopping basket, shopping cart dilemma. Animals are often used for metaphors. In the West, an owl quite often signifies wisdom, but in other countries, in South Asian countries, it signifies stupidity, so be careful with animals. A4 is a common format for printing in some countries, but in other countries it's a different size. So don't assume the same common paper format. Each locale will have its own set of laws. In Germany, it's against the law to use any comparative statements in your advertising, and if you do, a competitor might sue you. Belgium and Luxembourg also ban comparative advertising, and it's heavily regulated in Asia, whereas in the UK it's a little bit looser. We need to think about payment types. For example, in the UK we're quite happy to use our credit cards, whereas in Germany they're much less likely to use a credit card. You need to think about the technical environment. Within Japan, they often access the internet via a handheld device, whereas in the UK it is not the same proportion of people. Larger screens are often used, but that might be changing. So the entire lecture was based on Junker's book, and the reference is here, and so is the Dewey number in the Information Commons. If you want to look at this book, then I suggest you read just the first chapter. The remaining chapters just go into a little bit more detail. Hope you've enjoyed this video. Bye.